Good afternoon, I guess I should say now. Welcome to the Cornet Carolinas virtual January program, The State of the Economy. I'm Steve Garrett with Atrium Health and a member of the Cornet Carolinas Programs Committee. It's a new year. We put 2020 behind us, but in many ways, the first part of 2021 feels a lot like last year. Having said that, excuse me, every day we hear of someone else we know that's received a COVID vaccine, and I think there's a growing optimism that in 2021, maybe we are nearing the end of the pandemic. In January of 2020, Mark Vittner gave us an economic overview in person, if you guys remember that. That was quite optimistic. I remember visiting with Mark after the event and asking what could possibly happen to upset the great economic conditions we were having. Economic recessions have traditionally been caused by bubbles of one sort or another, and I just didn't see any bubbles forming that could cause a problem. In my wildest dreams, I never imagined that a pandemic would wreak havoc like it has on our economy. We're fortunate today to have Mark back with us to give us another snapshot of where we are and what we can expect as the year unfolds. Before we proceed, I just wanted to take a bit of time out to thank all the volunteers and sponsors that have made today's event possible. All of you folks that help out with this, our chapter wouldn't be where we are without all of the help of volunteers and sponsors. I'd now like to introduce my colleague, Lamont Johnson, who's filling in for our president, Anna Marshall, who's out on maternity leave. Lamont has a couple words to say.
Thanks, Steve. Hi, my name is Lamont Johnson. As Steve said, I'm the vice president of our great chapter, the Carolinas Cornet Global Chapter. Our leader and president, Anna Marshall, is not able to be with us because she just welcomed a new one into her family on Monday. But I'm thankful to be here for this program. Always look forward to this program every year, providing us information around the economy and forecasts for the future. So this is a great program that we look forward to every year. We thank all of you for joining. We thank all of you for being part of our organization. To echo Steve, we want to thank our sponsors and all of those on the programs committee who helped pull this all together. As a reminder, we do want to remind you that the chapter is excited to be hosting a post-COVID vision contest. The goal of the competition is to advance thinking of future office design through showcasing chapter talent and thought leadership. We are looking for teams of 2 to 5 for this particular contest. Some information was sent out from our Cornet Global to you all regarding that. Looking for teams to register by Friday, February the 5th, and then we'll have a big recognition and showcasing of that event and the teams on March the 11th. So definitely take advantage of that. Again, we appreciate you all joining, and we look forward to a great year for the chapter here in 2021. And I'll get out of the way so we can jump into the content. Thanks, Steve.
Great. Let me introduce Mark. I'm not sure Mark needs an introduction, but Mark is the managing director and senior economist with Wells Fargo Securities. We have heard from Mark before. Mark is great about presenting economic information in a way that's both very informative and entertaining, and we really appreciate him spending some time with us today. So without further ado, I'll just kick it over to Mark.
Great. And are you seeing our slides there? So I don't know whether let me just see something.
Yeah, we're not seeing them yet.
Yeah, for some reason when I
there we go. There we go. Now we can see.
There we go. All right, now we got them up there. In terms of, I don't know if I'm going to be able to make as bold a prediction as last year in terms of COVID. I was on a call yesterday, and there was a panel on healthcare and the economy out in Arizona, and the healthcare professionals that were on there were not quite as optimistic as I've been on COVID. I mean, we in our forecast, we're assuming that the pace of vaccinations will pick up and that we will reach a point, and I don't know whether you would call it herd immunity, but we would reach a point where there was enough confidence about public safety that people would re-engage in the economy somewhere between early and mid-summer. So, I would think that would be in June, somewhere in June or July. But even though we've seen some improvement in the pace of vaccinations, which in the last week, they averaged 1.25 million vaccinations a day. That was the week that ended Friday. Even though we've seen some improvement, I think one of the things that a lot of people thought was that folks who had COVID wouldn't need to be vaccinated. And what we're seeing with increasing frequency is that people that had COVID are getting COVID again, and that when they get COVID a second time, their outcome is worse. So folks who've had COVID are going to have to get the vaccine just like anybody else. And then, of course, there's the mutations. Our forecast still assumes, though, that we are going to see that we reach this level of confidence that COVID is coming under control, and people begin to re-engage in the economy somewhere around the middle of the year. If you look at what's happened in COVID cases, they appear to have peaked about 2 weeks ago. They're trending down in virtually every state and in all 4 regions of the country. And with that, we've begun to see a pickup in in economic engagement. It's ever so slight, because when you look at the high frequency data, they improved greatly after the economy hit bottom in mid-April. They improved up until around Memorial Day, improved more modestly over the summer when we had unrest in a lot of cities, and then weakened from mid-November to mid-January as this latest wave of COVID cases took off and really overwhelmed a lot of hospital systems. One of the changes that we're seeing, and one that we're on the positive side on here in Charlotte, is this third bullet that I have on here, where the geography of economic growth is changing. And what I mean by that is that folks are increasingly moving away from high cost, large, densely populated, expensive, globally connected cities like New York, Chicago, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. And they are moving to lower cost, smaller, but still substantial cities like Phoenix, Las Vegas, Salt Lake City, Denver, out west, even places like Reno and Boise are real popular, Dallas, Austin, and Texas, Houston and San Antonio too. And then here in the South, it's Atlanta, Charlotte, Nashville, Raleigh, Tampa, Jacksonville, and Northern Virginia. Those seem to be the big areas that you're seeing lots of folks move into. And it's interesting, you see an accelerated outmigration. I think that has legs. I think it's going to be, it is driven by the desire of individuals to increase their quality of life. And one of the easiest ways they can do that is lowering their housing costs. And so in these globally connected mega cities, you're seeing people move to the outer suburbs of those cities, neighboring states, or they're moving to an entirely different city entirely. And we're seeing that businesses are following them. And I think this is a real threat to California and New York. And I think that folks have been a little slow in catching on to it. And I chaired the advisory board, economic advisory board for the Cal Chamber for 3 years, and I still meet fairly regularly with the Cal Chamber. And one of the things that I mentioned the last time that I spoke with them was that for a long time, California didn't worry about losing businesses because they were losing large established companies, but they were generating so many new businesses. And with the experience of the pandemic, the need to be in San Francisco or in Silicon Valley, if you're a tech firm, is not as great as it used to be. Because if you're going to be meeting with a venture capital firm, you're probably going to be doing it over Zoom, even if you are in San Francisco. If you're going to be meeting with a law firm, you're probably going to be doing it over Zoom. And this would have been, to some extent, pre-pandemic, but it is certainly going to be the case post-pandemic because of congestion issues, and it's just so difficult. I know that the last time that I visited San Francisco, which was well before the pandemic, I started in Silicon Valley, went to East Bay, we had customer events, and we wound up coming back into San Francisco, where I had a video conference with a law firm from Silicon Valley where I started. I mean, it is It is a very difficult place to do business, and the new technologies that have been normalized because of the pandemic, which is what has happened with the ability to work remotely, I think are going to make it much easier for companies to move to other parts of the country and make it much easier for people to work remotely. The same is true in Southern California, where the fastest growing part of that economy has been digital entertainment. And I used the example yesterday. So one of the popular streaming shows right now is Cobra Kai. Cobra Kai takes place in part of Los Angeles. It would seem unnatural that you would film Cobra Kai in Los Angeles. Cobra Kai is filmed in Atlanta. I looked it up because I know a lot about Southern California, and I was watching it and I was seeing this monsoon in the background. And I said, it never rains like that in Los Angeles. And I said, so I pulled up to see where it was produced. Sure enough, they're making it in Atlanta. So the need to be in these high cost cities in industries that they thought they were very high barriers to entry, the pandemic has brought those down. And so now they have a real issue because they have to compete. They have a higher cost base and they have to compete with the Charlottes of the world. Even though they don't offer the same unique benefits. Well, the other thing that's changed with this move to secondary cities is that folks that would have rented because it was unaffordable, they were unaffordable to buy homes, and where they were previously are now looking to buy homes. Folks that are moving to the suburbs of those big cities are also looking to buy homes. And since the housing bust, the cost of developing raw land has increased dramatically, and building materials, workers are in short supply. The cost of building housing has gone up dramatically, and we're seeing that home prices are rising pretty dramatically because folks are not as willing to part with their home right now because people want to hold on to their homes because they need them to work from and for their children to go to school remotely from. So the housing market looks real strong. It's demand driven. It's not speculative. It's not being driven by speculation. I don't think it's the start of another bubble, but the dramatic increase in prices that we've seen, which is somewhere between 9 and 15%, depending on which price measure you look at, is not sustainable. Incomes aren't going to rise that much. I'm going to go through the charts fairly quickly. I want to make sure that we have time for Q&A. This is a chart on new COVID cases. It runs through, I guess it runs through Saturday of last week, and you can see the fairly substantial decline in COVID in all 4 regions of the country, the South being up there at the top. So we are beginning to see that hospital capacity, which has been stretched to the max and beyond, is beginning to ease up a little bit. In terms of GDP growth, we get fourth quarter GDP tomorrow. Our forecast is for around 4% growth. That looks pretty good. The economy started the fourth quarter in relatively good shape. It lost momentum at the tail end of the quarter. Our hunch is that first quarter growth, our forecast, I'd like to give a little more, is for 1.3% growth. We feel pretty good about that. I've mentioned this term high frequency data. And what high frequency data includes are things like the number of people who go through TSA checkpoints, the number of people who make online dinner reservations, the number of people who use a security card, who scan a security card to access their office building. It includes data that's pulled from smartphones, some credit card usage. We have daily surveys of consumer confidence that are as good as what used to be the monthly numbers. The Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas pulls all of the relevant data together, and they've come up with a weekly index, which does a very good job of tracking real GDP. It's not what we use to forecast real GDP, but based on that data, real GDP should rise, just based on that data alone, should rise around 4.5% in the fourth quarter. And right now, it looks like it would be up less than 1% in the first quarter. I mean, we do a far more thorough analysis than just looking at it as index, but generally it's going to be in the ballpark. And you can see how we had a sharp improvement from the middle of April, and then the improvement lessened somewhat over the summer. And the most recent data is kind of flattish. We also see that in the employment data. In the month of December, we lost 140,000 jobs. All of those job losses and then some were in restaurants. Restaurants lost 500,000 jobs in December. And the restaurant business, and I think most of those job losses were in California and New York. They weren't in Texas, they weren't in North Carolina, they weren't in Georgia, they weren't in Florida. Those states have the advantage of more outdoor dining options, and the weather's a little bit more temperate. And on top of that, government tends to be a partner with businesses instead of an adversary, which it is in California and New York, or at least is seen in California and New York. And the lockdowns in California and New York were much more comprehensive. And it didn't matter whether you could safely social distance. If you had an outdoor dining area, they still made restaurants close. So, so that's where most of those job losses were. We know that because we have the state employment data for the month of December, which came out on Friday of last week. When you look around the country and you see where unemployment rates are the lowest, they're mainly in the upper Midwest and in parts of the South, where governments have been a little more reluctant to close down the economy and have been fairly open-minded about opening the economy. If you remember back to late April, early May, I think it was late April, Georgia got a lot of criticism. The Georgia governor got a lot of criticism because he allowed all businesses to reopen. And I think everybody focused on tattoo parlors for some reason, but he allowed all businesses to reopen as long as they could do so and meet the CDC safety guidelines for social distancing and protection of employees and customers. So folks had to wear masks, you had to have plexiglass, you had to have outdoor seating, you know, all of those things. You had to have, you know, ventilation, you had to have all of those things had to be done. And the nationally, we've added back about 63% of the jobs that were lost since the recession. In Georgia, they've added back 82% of the jobs lost in March and April. In North Carolina, it's a little bit less than that, a little bit less than the nation, or right around the same as the nation. In Utah, they've regained over 100%. Employment's higher in Utah today than it was pre-pandemic. To look at what I mean by high frequency data, on the left is the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index, and you can see how consumer confidence plummeted at the onset of the pandemic. But the split between folks who work in professional in professional services and folks that work in high contact areas of the economy is also evident, because consumer sentiment did not plunge to where it was in the financial crisis, even though the unemployment rate rose to a higher level. On the right is a different set of consumer sentiment numbers that are produced by a group called Morning Consult. They ask the exact same questions that the University of Michigan does to an even larger sample of consumers, and they do it on a daily basis, and it's available by state. And what you see there a little more clearly is you can see the recovery from April. You can see the setback that we had from mid-November to January. And at the very tail end, you can see how all the states are beginning to turn positive once again. Of all the high frequency data, this series has had the greatest correlation with aggregate economic activity. When you look at how consumers have been behaving, they're not dining out as much. They're not spending as much to maintain their cars and trucks because they're not driving as much. Although new car sales have been pretty strong. They're not buying much clothing. They're not buying as much gasoline. They're spending more money on home improvements. They're spending more money on recreation equipment because they're not going to gyms. I've got 2 gyms that I'm still paying for that I don't go to, and I need to stop that. But they're spending more money on fitness equipment and things at their home, and so we've seen a move in wallet share. The other thing that's happened is that savings among upper middle to high income households have really increased dramatically. You see that credit card use has come down. That's almost all been at households with within a median income that's higher than the median for the economy as a whole. Another thing that's happened is that the amount of equity in people's homes has risen to a record level, not just because home prices have increased. If you look at the pace of that increase, it began in 2012. A lot of this has to do with the large number of people who switched to 15-year fixed mortgages or refinanced to lower interest rates and have been paying down more principal. We've also seen that people are staying in their homes longer, which means that they're paying down more principal. More recently, a lot of lenders have made it more difficult for folks to pull equity out of their homes when they refinance. And so that's helped continue this buildup in equity. It's an awful lot of firepower available for when when the economy turns back on again. Don't need to go through all these charts. This is inventories of existing homes. They're at an all-time low. Inventories of new homes are at an all-time low. Interesting little thing here. I wrote about it late last month, that where we really are seeing a crunch in housing right now, where there's a lot of demand and not a lot of supply, are in trade-up homes. And typically, it would be older millennials, it would be baby boomers whose children have gone away to school or moved away from home and are deciding to downsize and buy something smaller, maybe buy a townhome. You're not seeing that today because those folks are having to work out of their homes, entertain out of their homes. Their children may have come back from college or may have come back from where they were working to live out of their homes. They need the space. At the same time, more people want more space. And so there's been this crush of demand. And the other thing that's happened is that credit has been tightened. Credit underwriting has been tightened at the lower end of the credit spectrum. And so a disproportion of the people who qualify for homes, mortgages now are upper income households. And so you've had this crush of demand. That's one of the reasons why the median price of existing homes has increased so much. And when you look around in Charlotte, it's more the higher price neighborhoods that have seen the big jump in home values. And with inventory so low, home building has taken off. Overall housing starts rose to a 1.7 million unit annual rate in December. We're not going to stay that high, but we're probably going to be around 1.45 million units for the year in overall housing starts. So, really good numbers, strongest the housing market's been since 2006. In terms of commercial real estate, we're seeing that vacancy rates are rising for all product categories. The office market is, the one that's of most interest because people are wondering what the future of the office building is. Only about 27% of office workers are going into the office right now. I do think it's going to change. I don't know when we're going to go back to work. I think, right now people are circling June 1st. My own view is that it's probably going to be closer to September 1st. That's just my own personal view, because I think it's going to take longer to corral COVID. Retail vacancies are another area that have gotten a lot of attention because of all the bankruptcies at major retailers. A typical shopping mall would have 4 anchor department stores. I'm not sure that there will be 4 anchor department stores a year from now that exist. So shopping malls are really going to have to rethink how they do business. Power centers are in much the same way. COVID has probably accelerated the move to online retailing by at least 10 years. And the one area that's been good for has been the warehouse market, but there's been a lot of deliveries in the industrial market. Vacancy rates are relatively low. Pricing there has been pretty good. Apartment vacancies have also risen. These are national numbers. They've risen a little bit more in Charlotte because at the time the pandemic hit, we had a larger share of the apartment universe being delivered. We had a lot of new apartments that were under construction than just about any other part of the country. The South End market was one of the top sub markets in the country for deliveries in 2000. And so, certainly we've seen some increase in vacancy there. When you look at commercial property prices, you see a sharp drop in prices for retailing, less appreciation in office. And what you're seeing in office is only a handful of transactions. As far as I can tell, the transactions that are taking place in Charlotte are taking place at some pretty good prices still, but there's a wide gap between what people think an office building's worth and what the owner thinks an office building's worth. And I don't think that's going to straighten out until we're a year past COVID and people can see how the office market shakes out. I believe that the only place that you can establish and maintain a corporate culture is in the office environment, and that's very important in service-based businesses because your culture is what sets you apart. I think that what we're going to find is that there are certain functions that can be performed remotely very well. Customer service center jobs are one of the larger components that I think can be done relatively well. The other thing that I think is going to come of this is that we're going to find that workers that may have left the workforce are more likely to stay. Kind of the tail end of the baby boom that might have been that's going to be nearing that will, I guess, will reach 65 in the year 2026. Normally you see a lot of retirements leading up to, when people get from 55 to 65, you see the labor force participation drops off. I think we may see a little bit of a lessening of that because of the greater ability and greater acceptance to work remotely. Another thing that we may see in the labor market is that with more people able to work remotely, it'll be predominantly women with school-age children will be able to enter the workforce or stay in the workforce. And also, I think that a lot more handicapped folks who have some sort of a physical limitation that would have made it difficult for them to commute to work will now be able to participate to a greater extent in the labor market. So I think it's a positive for the economy overall. In terms of the office market, I would be surprised if more than 10% of the universe of office workers that were working in office buildings pre-pandemic shifted to remote work. I don't think it's anything beyond that. I'd be surprised if it's more than 10%. And on the space needs side, workers are going to be spaced out. And every time I say that, I don't mean to. There's going to be more space per worker. And when we go back to the office, and so it may not be a complete wash, but it's closer to a wash in terms of office demand from COVID. So I think that's where office is going forward. Industrial apartments are seeing a lot of demand in the suburbs right now. I want to save some time for questions, so I'm going to speed through some of these. I'm going to get to Charlotte in just a second. This is one of my favorite charts because it shows just how much things have changed in San Francisco. These are daily asking rents for apartments in San Francisco. The line just above that is New York City. The line just above that is Los Angeles. Where we have seen a bit of improvement is Miami, which had been very negative and is becoming less negative. At the top are Charlotte, Raleigh, Durham, and the lower one is Dallas, Dallas-Fort Worth. And so, all of those areas, that is not to say that apartment rents are higher today than they were pre-pandemic in Charlotte. I don't think they are. I think it really reflects all the new apartments that have come on the market. In terms of interest rates, we're not expecting the Fed to raise rates. They've said themselves they're not going to raise interest rates until the inflation has been above 2% for at least a year. So I think that at the earliest, that would be later in 2022, probably in 2023, we don't have a rate hike in our forecast. Looking at Charlotte, similar trends to the national numbers in terms of the timing of employment. We lost jobs in March and April. We've regained 111,000 of the 180,000 jobs that we lost during the lockdowns. So we've recovered almost 2/3. That's not the same performance that Atlanta has done. Atlanta's done better. It's not, well, Metro Atlanta's done better. It's not the same performance that Salt Lake City has done, but it's fairly good. Cities have been hit a little bit harder. That's where most of your restaurants are. And if you look at the one area that's on the plus side is financial services, which has actually gained employment over the last year. And I would say that the tech sector in Charlotte, which is a component of other components in there, is also higher today than it was previously. Looking at the mobility data that is gleaned from smartphones, you can see that it dipped quite a bit in that November through January period. It also includes, Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's, so they would have had a dip anyway. We don't have a lot of previous periods to look at from that, but it is recovering fairly solidly right now. Looking at some real estate trends here in terms of home sales, you can see that closed sales are up, much greater proportion than listings, and that's a story just about everywhere. Although, we're a little bit better than some markets. I mean, we have, there are a lot of markets that have listings below where they were a year ago. That's where they are from a national perspective. Looking at the housing market, we're seeing the single family construction's trending up. Apartment construction's probably peaked for the cycle. Looking at apartment vacancy rates, this is through the fourth quarter, it's the third quarter of the year. You can see that vacancy rates have spiked as we've had a lot of, I should say, have risen as we've had a lot of deliveries on the market. This is some of the migration data that we're looking at. This is from LinkedIn profiles, and most workers are on LinkedIn. Now, usually when I give a talk to an audience, I ask how many people are on LinkedIn. And Charlotte had been the #2 city, I guess, on a year-to-year basis. But just looking from April to October, the cities that have really gained momentum have been Phoenix, Nashville, and Tampa, and Jacksonville. Jacksonville wasn't even on the list. Charlotte's still doing very well. I mean, anybody who's on in this top 10 list is gaining. You look at who's losing the most: Hartford, New York, San Francisco, Chicago. I mean, those are some those are cities that have been in long-term structural decline. If you look at the population growth numbers, the latest ones that we have from census are for 2019. The relevant period to look at COVID is not even 2020, because the data goes mid-year to mid-year. And that's one of the reasons we like to we're looking at alternative measures like the LinkedIn data and the Redfin data and some of the data from the moving companies, because that data reflects the 20 to 21 period, which we're not going to get for a couple of years. We've got our forecast going out for the state. We're expecting North Carolina to come back a little bit faster than the rest of the country. We're looking for some strength in manufacturing to really help the state, because inventories have been drawn down, and the supply chain is facing some challenges. We're short of a lot of product, a lot of raw materials, and I think that'll be good for North Carolina manufacturers. So let me stop there and open it up for any questions that anyone might have.
Mark, we've got a couple.
Slideshow too, so I can see.
Yeah, your comment about who you think's going to go. How many people you think are going to go back to work? They wanted you to clarify. Did you say 10%? You thought?
No, I would be surprised if any more than 10% of workers that, if you look at the universe of all the people that were working, I would be surprised if we saw more than 10% of that pre-pandemic workforce shift to remote work. So I expect 90% of the office workforce to return to the workplace, at least 90%.
Right. We have another question about stock market and whether the stock market whether we see corrections. I mean, there's been an assessment that a lot of the anticipated growth in 2021 and years on has already been priced into the stock market. And so the question is were they too enthusiastic and we're going to see corrections, or or will we continue to, have they gotten it right?
Well, we really haven't seen much of a correction since the Fed came in and restored liquidity to the markets in March. So we're due for some sort of a correction. I mean, typically we see we'll have some 5% pullbacks and some 10% pullbacks and even a 20% pullback or something that comes close to 20%. And, I would think that we would see that, we were probably poised to see it in post-election, but we got the news on the vaccine, a couple of days after the election, we got the news on the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine. And I do think that, I think folks are maybe a little too optimistic about the near-term outlook. Business Week is I guess the Business Week that comes out today is going to talk about, are we going to see a repeat of the Roaring '20s, and talking about similarities between today and the 1920s. I haven't read the article. I just got an email from Peter Coy and who wrote the piece. And I think it looks more like the 1970s. I don't think he'll have me in there because I don't think he want, I think the decade looks more like the 70s than it does the 20s. And I think that, given the budget deficits, the addiction to stimulus that we seem to have, and I wouldn't be surprised if economic activity comes roaring back, but I think inflation is going to surprise us to the upside. It's going to tie the Fed's hands, and we'll probably have a shorter business cycle than what we've seen the last few decades.
Related to that, I've got a personal question about consumer behavior. Consumers have got used to not spending money on eating out and not spending money on traveling and not spending money on, gasoline and car maintenance because they're not commuting anymore. With regards, especially to the entertainment, the eating out, there's a school of thought that says as soon as people are able, they're gonna start eating out like crazy, and they're gonna start traveling like crazy, especially because they've accumulated a lot of money during the pandemic because they haven't spent money on those things.
Well,
but there's also a school of thought that says, well, maybe they got a little hook to it, and they realized how much money they were saving, and maybe they will continue, to use DoorDash, not eat out as much and that kind of thing. So.
I think you're right on that. I mean, I think that there's going to be both of that. Certainly, when things reopen, I think and it's encouraging here in Charlotte. If you read the Business Journal, you can see how many restaurant groups are, they're taking a very cautious stance, but they are working to open new restaurant concepts and try to time it. They're like, we're not going to open too soon. Let's late spring. Let's reopen then when we have some outdoor seating. But there's going to be all sorts of new restaurants. And one of the things that people worry about with long or deep recessions is that we're going to see all sorts of skill obsolescence. But with so many of the workers that have been displaced in this industry, in really entry-level type jobs in the hospitality industry that has a lot of turnover at restaurants, I don't think that you're going to see a whole lot of skill obsolescence. What I'm concerned about are that supply chain issues are going to drive up the cost of doing business, in that a lot of restaurants are going to be in fairly fragile financial hands, and that we're going to see that a lot of restaurants are going to have a hard time making a go of it when they don't have continued assistance from the federal government. So I'm a little concerned about that. I think that from a consumer behavior standpoint, there's a couple of things in consumer behavior. This whole Robinhood phenomena is a big head scratcher. What you're seeing with GameStop and is those are things that you usually see around a market top, and it may be one of the reasons the stock market opened down a little bit today. But I do think that that consumers are well aware of the money that they've saved by not going out as much. And on top of that, there's one other variable, and that consumers have diverted a lot of that savings into buying nicer TVs, buying nicer furniture so they can stay at home, buying outdoor furniture, buying the Solo stoves so they can keep warm on the chilly night. And so, they've got a lot of fixed costs that they've sunk on home entertainment, and I think that that's going to be a competitor for for folks going out. So we get a nice bounce back, but then it slows after that.
We have a question about inflation. Certainly, we have monetary and fiscal policy that has spent a lot of money. What are your thoughts about inflation?
Well, I think that it's certainly going to come back in the next few months because inflation plummeted at the onset of the pandemic because we had some very unusual thing, big drops in airfares, big drops in insurance because people weren't driving and insurance companies gave rebates. So we're going to be up against that. And so year to year, we're going to see inflation pop up to 3%. I'm concerned about that longer term, though. The Fed is saying, oh, well, we've undershot inflation, so we can overshoot it a while. Maybe we can go to 2.5%. I don't think that they can tune it that finely. I just don't think that's they've had so much success with inflation. When they tried to get it at 2%, they tried to lower it, it went too low. My guess is it's going to surprise us to the upside. When the Federal Reserve, when we run budget deficits, we're running huge budget deficits. We just did a $900 billion stimulus. Biden would like to do $1.9 trillion. That's 9% of our GDP. There's no, if we spend $1.9 trillion, we have to get that money from somewhere. And China's not going to lend us $1.9 trillion. It's not going to buy any, none, zilch. They're not going to buy $1 of that debt. U.S., we're not going to buy. We have been buying some of it because bank deposits have gone up and so bank security holdings have been larger. But if the economy is doing better, the economy starts growing, loan demand is going to pick up. So, interest rates are going to rise a little bit, but who's going to buy most of that debt is the Federal Reserve. And when the Federal Reserve buys it, they debit the account of Wells Fargo, they debit the account of Goldman Sachs. And that creates new money that money supply is up 50% year to year. We never saw anything like that in the 1970s when we had, fairly horrendous inflation, the worst inflation. The Federal Reserve refers to it as the Great Inflation, in terms of it's like the Great Depression and the Great Recession. I'm concerned that we're going to see higher inflation. It's not going to be as bad as it was in the 70s, but it's not just the Federal Reserve. I mean, I hate to. I don't want to sound political. I don't want to sound, be nitpicky or anything. But the significance of killing the Keystone Pipeline is that the regulatory, the significance, the big takeaway. For one thing, Keystone Pipeline, it's not going to affect the availability of oil in the U.S. in 2021, 22, 23. It may be more meaningful in the latter part of the decade, but it's not going to have an immediate effect on anyone. But what it is a huge call out that the regulatory environment, just as when Trump approved it, it sent a loud message that the regulatory environment was turning more favorable. The regulatory environment is going to turn less favorable, and that's going to add to inflationary pressures as well. And I think a real contrarian bet where everybody's going out against the oil companies. I think you're going to see oil prices surprise us to the upside in 2 to 3 years. I don't think we're going to get to $100 a barrel again, but I do think that we're going to see oil prices surprise us to the upside as the global economy comes back, wakes back up.
We have a question that I would classify as almost a January 2020 question, and that was, excluding COVID-related items, what do you see as the biggest risk to the national and local markets in the coming years?
Excluding COVID in the coming year, the greatest risk, I think, is the greatest risk is that inflation comes back in a more problematic way, and it ties the Fed's hands. It ties the Fed's hands, and it ties basically fiscal policy's hands where they can't do much to counteract the slowing of the economy, and that we have another recession take hold. I doubt it takes hold in 2021, but it could happen in 2022. That would be one thing I think is an immediate risk. Second risk, I mean, kind of far out there. God, I hope I'm not right about this. But China's been more assertive. Um, and, um, I went through an exercise with, wargaming a conflict between China and the U.S. In the Taiwan Straits, and how it gets started and how it impacts, what the impact is. But it starts with China making aggressive moves toward Taiwan, and the U.S. responds, puts a carrier group in there, and Chinese and American planes are flying up against one another, and there's an accident, and planes collide, and pilots die. What happens to the market, and how do countries respond? That I think is the potential. There's potential for real problems there. I can just tell you that the end of the story was that it ended, after going through a lot of different iterations, it ended with the Korean stock market being down 97% and the Japanese stock market being down 93%, and pretty much a global economic disaster. It ended in the U.S. Taking a defeat, basically China being able to go into Taiwan, and South Korea and Japan having little confidence that they're going to be able to remain independent. So it was, that's kind of a nightmarish scenario. But if you think about what could really go wrong, I could see, that's probably the area, maybe not the nightmare scenario, but something that really upends the global financial markets.
We have a question about urban to suburban office migration, and does it vary on top tier markets versus smaller markets like Charlotte, Raleigh, and Greenville, South Carolina?
It does vary a little bit in that when you get to smaller markets, the uptown and the downtown markets seem to be, they almost have a suburban feel to them. I mean, Greenville kind of has, it's definitely a downtown area, but it kind of has a suburban feel to it. And some of the more successful suburban markets have a little bit of an urban feel to them. And I think that the big challenge for suburban markets, and I think that Ballantyne is a good example, is that their success kind of is in their own undoing. Because if you work at an office building, and you've got a small cafe in the building, but going out to lunch is going to be a 2-hour ordeal, that begins to be a real cost of doing business in the suburbs. And so that's why Ballantyne's trying to make itself more walkable. And so, I do think there are some limits to this move back to the suburbs. There are a lot of advantages in folks working together, but there's concern. I mean, there's concern about that. The head of Moderna said that he felt that COVID was never going to be eradicated, and he feels that we'll never get rid of COVID. That we'll be able to control it to some extent, and we'll be able to contain it through annual booster shot to cover whatever new iterations come about, but it's going to be with us for forever and ever. Kind of a Donnie Downer. You got to remember that Moderna does make the shots, so it's in their interest. That would be a good business plan for them too, but certainly a possibility. Other thing to think about is how many pandemics have we had in the last 20 years coming out of China? And not necessarily China, but coming out of the Far East, not, so we say China, the Far East. And it works out to 1 every 3 years. And so building resiliency into the work environment is going to be very important well after we get past COVID. So that may be, and given that office towers, you've got to put people in elevators, even if you space them out, and you still have to put people in elevators. You could have contactless elevators. You can do all that good stuff, but it gets awfully hard given that people tend to arrive at work and leave work right around the same time. So, that would, tend to argue that the move to the suburbs has some legs. And again, the move to the suburbs, companies tend to follow where their workers want to be. And part of this is demographics. It's that the millennials are reaching a point in their lives where they're getting married and having babies. And so if your workers are out in the suburbs, you want to have, your businesses are going to want to locate offices close to where their workers are.
There's a show that's beginning to trend on Twitter, on Netflix rather, called the Minimalists. And, we've seen a bit of that, I think, with millennials, where millennials are choosing both locations to work and locations within cities that are more experiential driven and less sort of materialistic driven. This idea of a quarter-acre lot and suburban household, that doesn't apply with millennials. They also tend to choose jobs that are more mission driven than I think a lot of their other peers. Is minimalism, is that a fad, or is that something that might begin to take hold?
Well, I think it's something that's probably going to take hold because technology enables you to be more of a minimalist. I think it's probably more evident in Generation Z than it is in millennials, because the millennials came up in the day of the internet, and Z came up in the age of mobile devices. And I was listening to the head of one of the studios, and he said that he didn't see movie theaters coming back. He didn't see movie theaters surviving in a major way, that they were going to have to find niches where there was some other type of entertainment, there was more entertainment tied into them. So maybe the ones that have drinks and food and things might do well. But he says the problem is, he says, you look at the young generation, you look at teenagers or Zs, and whatever comes after the Zs. But I think teenagers are still Z, the Generation Z. He says they don't even watch movies on a flat screen TV. They're watching it on their smartphones. That's where they watch their content. And so, it gets to be technology allows you to be a real minimalist. And I had a guy that worked for me at the University of Virginia, and he finally broke down and bought a TV when Virginia was playing for the national championship. But before that, he was just watching the games on his smartphone. He has a small phone too. It's so it is technology is allowing people to be a little bit more minimalist. You can rent, you don't have to own. It's like I think back to I guess all of us have become a little bit more minimalist. I remember when I saw what the iPod was, I immediately went out and sold all my CDs. Well, I burned all my CDs onto I bought an iPod, burned them all on there, and sold them all before they were going to be useless. You used to have stacks of record albums or CDs. We're all becoming minimalist to some degree because of technology, but I think it's more adept at younger folks than it is for everyone else.
Great. Okay, we're at time. Mark, thank you very much. We really appreciate your time and your expertise and your insight into these into all these numbers. For those of you that are on the call, we will share both the deck and the recording with everyone. So you'll be able to go back and re-listen. But thanks again, Mark. We appreciate your alliance with CoreNet Global.
Have a good day.
Great. We're adjourned. Thanks, guys.